Hi, I'm Susan Weisbauer, co-author of The Well-Trained Mind.
And I'm Susanna Jarrett, editor at the Well-Trained Mind Press. And we're talking about education for all parents and for all children in all sorts of settings. And today, we are going to be answering your questions from our wonderful listeners. Since we started this podcast, we have been receiving emails with thoughts and ideas and sometimes pushback and lots of interesting questions. And we really, truly appreciate that. So we wanted to dedicate some time before closing out season 2 to respond to your questions.
And if we don't get to yours, don't worry. We'll do this again.
Yes, we got so many questions. We won't be able to answer them all today, but we're going to do our best to answer as many as we can.
Indeed.
So why don't we just dive right in? We're going to start with some more general questions before going into questions more specific to the younger years and the older years of education. But our first question comes from Cara, and her question was, what is your response to the accusation that the Well-Trained Mind book is not classical enough, but is actually only neoclassical and is based primarily on Dorothy Sayers' misunderstanding of the trivium as an age-based division versus a true order for learning anything?
Ooh, starting out a little spicy here. That one sounded quite aggressive.
Might as well start spicy, right?
I like it that this is an accusation. So look, yes, the Well-Trained Mind is neoclassical. I've been saying this for 20 years, okay? Mm-hmm. And so it's quote unquote only neoclassical. Okay, people, time for a reality check. Nobody doing classical education, and I mean, not us, not Memoria Press, not Classical Academic Press, not Athanasi, none of us are doing quote unquote true classical education, because education is a response to the times in which you live. A purpose of education is to help you understand and process the information that is important for you in your time and in your society. So none of us should be trying to reproduce what the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans were doing. If we did, we'd have this incredibly limited, sexist, elitist, and impractical education available really only to, rich people who happen to be boys. But I won't get too sidetracked onto that. The quote unquote classical curriculum of the Romans and Greeks had no science in it. Mm-hmm. It was purely a literary education. And in today's world, we can't have a purely literary education. Science is too big a part of our daily existence. What we do reproduce from ancient classical education is this idea that you don't start out immediately with original work and having your own idea. The place of modeling, copy work, repetition in the ancient classical curriculum is so central to a good method of teaching. It's so central to getting difficult skills across to students in a way that is clear and makes sense to them, that we have taken from the ancient curriculum and have reproduced. A lot of what we talk about in the grammar and the logic stages of the Well-Trained Mind is a reimagining of that way of teaching, of making copy work, modeling, looking at what an expert does, reproducing it yourself before you try to do it originally. So much of that is actually based on ancient classical education. Now, here's the thing. We know more about development than the ancient Greeks and Romans did. Okay? Mm-hmm. We have to be really careful of this sort of chronological snobbery that elevates the ancient Greeks and Romans to some sort of pinnacle of educational attainment. Mm-hmm. There was a lot that was good about that system and a lot that was flawed and that we can do better. What Dorothy Sayers was doing was taking the trivium, which, by the way, was not actually an ancient classical model. We've talked about this. I think we talked about this in our first season, didn't we, Susanna?
In our first season, we had a whole episode on where classical education came from, which we dive deeper into this. Yeah.
Yes. And I highly recommend you go back and listen to that if you haven't heard it. What Dorothy Sayers actually did was take the idea of the trivium, which is a Renaissance interpretation of classical education, so it's not even ancient classical, and map it onto what educational psychologists were learning about the way that the brain develops. So yes, it's neoclassical. It was not a misunderstanding It was a reinterpretation, which is what we have to do when we educate in the present day. So I don't know, this particular question had a bunch of buzzwords in there that kind of made me mad. There's the accusation, there's the not classical enough, there's the only neoclassical, there's the misunderstanding of the trivium, and there's versus a true order, okay? It's very easy to sort of elevate some sort of Platonic ideal of education and then criticize methods that don't line up against it. Education is child-based. Education is about training children to think in the best, most effective, most interesting ways possible. And so I hope we always are adapting. And again, we're all neoclassical. My advice to you would be, if you see books or curricula which are claiming to be more classical or the only true classical way, I would go the other direction.
Yeah. And I would also point, if you're interested in this topic to learn more, we do have a few episodes in season 1 relevant to this. We talk about what is classical education in our first episode. And we also talk about the history of classical education, where it came from, where it's going, where we kind of discuss this notion of neoclassical, because that's a term that it sounds like this listener was thinking that we would shy away from, which we actually don't. Call ourselves neoclassical all the time. And so now that our blood is flowing with a question that was much more maybe aggressive than most of them, I promise. Let's move on. Leah asked, can you talk about how to homeschool several children at once? And she gives a little more context. She says, I'd like to avoid teaching separate lessons in each subject to each of my children. Yes, that sounds like a lot of work to me. But
Indeed.
How do I do this? Is it necessary or helpful for biology and ancient history to be taught in the same year? Are there other subjects that ought to stay with history's 4-year cycle?
Very good question. So I homeschooled 4 children who were within 9 years of each other. So I am familiar with the exhaustion that comes over you when you're contemplating 5 different subjects, 4 different children, that you're up to 20 subjects. So let me sort of back into this. I want to start with the end of the question, which was, is it necessary or helpful for biology and ancient history to be taught in the same year? Are there other subjects that ought to stay with history's 4-year cycle? So I want to say right off that our suggestion that you pair a science with a particular period of history was simply an organizing strategy. It was a way for you to sort of try to keep the subjects more related to each other. But there is absolutely no reason why you have to, in order to get a good education, pair any particular subjects to each other. I think that this reader probably has an older edition of The Well-Trained Mind, in which we talked about how if you do biology and then you do earth science and astronomy and then you do chemistry and then you do physics and you pair those with ancient history, medieval history, Renaissance, early modern history, and modern history, then you're going to come across the scientists in your history, because the major advances in each of those fields happened during the period of history being studied. That's great. That provides you with a more natural connection between the subjects than otherwise you might have, but it is 100% not essential. And in fact, in the last 2 editions of The Well-Trained Mind, we have said, look, you can follow our original 4-year science pattern, or maybe you want to do 6 weeks of biology, 6 weeks of astronomy. I think we offer in the later editions several different ways that you can arrange your sciences depending on your resources, how many kids you've got, how old they are. So first of all, I just want to remove any burden that this parent might be feeling, that she's got to stick with a certain correspondence between science and history study.
That makes sense. And I think on this podcast, we've often come back around to this idea of like what is absolutely necessary. I think we've talked a lot on episodes about burnout and episodes about the outside gaze, about, you are here homeschooling to find what works for your family. And there's wherever we can take the pressure off and say, you can be creative and figure out what works for your student. That's what we're here to do.
So then sort of let's back up to the central question, which is, how do you homeschool several children at once without teaching separate lessons in each subject to each child? So I think the rule of thumb here that you keep in mind is that you divide your skill subjects, but you group together your content subjects. So every child has got to do the writing, math, grammar, spelling on their own level. From year to year, there is so much change in every child between what they can handle from year to year that it is absolutely vital that each child be allowed to go at their own pace, tackle their own problems, and develop their skills. So there's no way around that. You have got to think about your language arts and your math as being something that you tailor to each child. Now, it can be helpful if you are at least using the same curricula for each child, because then you as the parent have less of a learning curve in terms of figuring out what you're doing the next day. So that can be a help for you, but you also have to keep in mind that within a family, one child might prosper with the curriculum and the next child might absolutely loathe it.
Right.
And no learning will happen if the kid hates the curriculum. So first, try the lower levels of whatever program you were using with the older children on the younger children, but don't get stuck on it. And if a younger child really resists a curriculum that was completely successful with an older child, you've got to have the flexibility to allow them to try something else.
Right. Right. And this makes me think about coming from a classroom, teaching and classroom background, when you're for those subjects that kind of require you to teach at different levels, right? Math and grammar. If you're doing math with multiple students at one time, you can also build routines in, because this is so important when you have a classroom. To run the classroom, you have to have routines where the child knows, okay, after breakfast, I go grab my math supplies. Mom's going to work with this kid first. This is what I do if I have a question, but I can't talk to mom or dad right now. I have a routine. Maybe I have a book next to me that I read until it's my turn for mom to come help me, or whatever that routine is. You can build routines to kind of help your kids know what to do while they're waiting for you. Just help that to run smoothly.
And then if we can then just sort of talk briefly about the subject areas, you have to separate out the skill areas, but the subject areas, by which I mean history, science, geography, to a large extent, literature, those you can combine. You can do one period of history for all of your kids, because remember, we're gonna let go of this idea that you've got to pair science with it, in some particular order. My general rule is that for kids who still need a lot of support, so they're not really capable of much independent work, is that you key the content of your subject area to the oldest student and let the others listen in. So if you're doing history, for example, pick a history program or history curriculum that's appropriate for the older student, and then just read it out loud and let the younger ones listen in. Are they going to get everything? No. Are they going to get something? Absolutely. So, and then you'd be surprised how much younger children can pick up by watching their older siblings doing experiments or doing history projects. You can even have an older student do a history project and present it to the younger students. There are a lot of ways that you can sort of draw all of them into one learning group. And in fact, this was sort of the model of the one-room schoolhouse. You had all ages in one room, and the olders could help actually teach and tutor the youngers. So that's what you kind of want to be aiming for. Now, if once kids get 3 or 4 years apart, you really, particularly as your older students move into middle school and high school, you're going to have to separate them a little bit more from the younger ones. But by that point, the older students should be capable of doing some independent work so that you can go over their assignment with them, give them their tasks, and then you can turn around and pay some attention to the youngers, and the older student won't immediately, fall off their chair, drop their pencil, do all the things that grammar stage students tend to do. So it does get a little bit easier, and you have more flexibility in what levels you're teaching as your older students become more independent. And it will happen eventually.
Yeah, I definitely, from being homeschooled, some of my happiest memories were those subjects that we did together, like history, sitting with my siblings and listening to Story of the World, or doing activities together. Even if I couldn't do the activity, watching my siblings do it was such a highlight of my time growing up, as well as any time my siblings taught me, which is a bonus because the best way to learn something is to teach it, right? So wherever I got to learn from my older brothers, that was just so cool to me. All right, so let's keep moving on because we are trying to get through as many of your questions as we can. Our next question comes from Elizabeth, who asks, can you address the logistics of having one or more children homeschooling and one at a brick and mortar school? So my eldest is attending a classical style public charter next year while my middle and youngest are still at home. I'm interested in your thoughts on the practical dynamics and making this easier. For example, how to use commute times, the lack of schedule flexibility, etc.
Yeah. I mean, it is going to be a little bit tricksy. But I would say maybe keep three things in mind. The first is that you've got to have an absolutely ironclad commuting plan. You've got to know every single day who's dropping the kid off. This says public charter school. It doesn't look to me like they have a bus service. So you and your partner, spouse, whoever's helping you with this project here, have got to have an absolutely ironclad schedule of who's dropping the kid off and who is picking them up every single day, because the other person is going to have to be responsible for keeping things running at home. I would encourage you, if at all possible, and of course, I don't know what your work situation is, not to get in the position where every morning you're putting all of the kids in the car, driving to school, dropping one of them off, and then driving the other kids back home again. I have done this. It is a time suck for the younger ones, because with the best intentions in the world, they're not going to get much done in the car. Yes, you can put on an audiobook, but also there's the fact that part of the reason why you're homeschooling them is because, for whatever reason, again, I don't know a lot about this family's situation, you have decided that they're not ready, or it will be best for them not to go into a classroom situation. Yet, if you are basically putting them in the car every single morning to ride to school, you're reproducing a big part of that situation right there. So if you can arrange your schedules so that, one parent drops the kid off, the other allows the younger ones to get up and eat breakfast in their pajamas, or however you run your mornings, that is going to make the rest of the day go so much more smoothly. I remember some of the most frantic and unproductive days of homeschooling being the ones where I had to get everybody up and in the car, everybody, including the little ones, at a certain point, early in the morning. It is just a very difficult way to start a homeschooling day. And with younger students, you put them in the car, you drive, you get back home, you take them out of the car. You know what they're ready to do now? Not study, not learn. They're ready to play. They're ready to sleep. They're ready to eat, but it just doesn't set up the day for learning. So I guess I don't know, Suzanne, you have anything to add on this front?
No, I think that's a really good insight. I just imagine getting out from even a little car drive. The last thing you want to do is just start something new. It feels like a relief to be home. Like you just got home from work, or you got home from school, and now you're starting the homeschool day. That doesn't make sense. So I agree for sure.
Yeah. I guess the second thing I would say is that if possible, and this may not be possible at all, if you can use any of the same curricula with the middle and youngest that your oldest is using at the public charter school, it's going to create a lot more connection and a lot more opportunity for learning to happen between siblings, for your older student to talk to the youngers about what he's learning in a way that's really meaningful and can reinforce the learning that you're doing, rather than feeling like you're doing two completely separate things. Yeah.
And also maybe keep the one in school from feeling like odd man out at the dinner table when they're doing something completely different than the kids at home.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And then I would just say the third thing is, and maybe this is less of a practical dynamic, but it's still practical. I think you're all going to have to come to an understanding that the kids at home are going to get to do fun stuff that the older kid doesn't get to do. And the kid at school is going to get to do fun stuff that the younger ones don't get to do. There's going to be cool field trips and opportunities. Then on the other hand, for the younger children, they're going to get to stay home. And if they don't feel good, or they want to have a day off, or you decide to go do a special outing during the day, they're going to get to do that. You're going to have to sort of keep an eye on the dynamics so that nobody feels slighted by the other people's opportunities.
Right. I was going to say, this seems like it would be difficult to do without some amount of buy-in from the kids, they would have
Yeah.
to sort of agree that I want to go to school. I don't want to go to school, because if you have a kid who wants to go to school, who's staying home while another kid is going, it seems like that would be really hard to navigate.
That's a really good point. And this parent specifically said that she was more interested in hearing about the practical dynamics than the sort of emotional ones. But let's go ahead and step over that line. Yeah, I like this idea, Susanna, that getting buy-in from all of the students is really important, and that they all understand that any educational situation has both pros and cons.
Right.
And sometimes when you're middle of a con, you're going to think that the person who's doing the other track, doing the other school option, has all of the greatest things going on.
Right.
So if there's any way that they can be honest with each other, and I don't know how old these kids are, but be honest with each other and say, hey, like the older kid, this is this fantastic thing that happened today. I'm so glad that I got to do it. But you know what? Then this happened, and I just really wished I were at home. If they can sort of be open with each other about the pros and cons of each educational choice, I just think it would provide some, not only a chance for them to communicate, but just some stability, I guess, in the situation.
That makes sense. Well, our next question is from Becky, and it's sort of related to this, kids in different situations theme. She asks, how do I sustain my energy during the years where some students have graduated, but I still have one or two more to go? I'd love to hear more about navigating the changing dynamics that take place after you start graduating kids, but still have elementary aged ones to bring up. From becoming too tired to keep doing things enthusiastically. She talks about doing every project in the Story of the World workbook, to the senioritis attitude of the older kids trickling down to younger ones. How do I reignite a love of learning and finish strong?
Oh, man, I have been there.
Yeah, I know you've talked about it on the podcast.
I have. So those of you who've been listening to this podcast will know that I actually put my youngest into a Montessori middle school for 3 years because my energy was gone, absolutely gone. And then we brought her back to do high school at home, and that was a good experience for all of us. But I mean, I do think that if you've got some of your students have graduated, you've got one or two to go, and you're thinking, I just can't do this. It is probably time to think about whether you need to make some major change. Look, and I actually think this parent mentioned the episode that we did on burnout. So if any of you were feeling this way, you've sort of got that sense of, oh, I just can't possibly get up and do this again. Please do go back and listen to that episode on burnout, because sometimes what you have to do is acknowledge that you really can't do it anymore.
Right.
You can only push yourself to get up every morning and do something you don't want to do for so long.
Yeah.
Now, there are some more practical things to do. Sometimes actually changing curricula might give you a little bit of a boost, a little bit of a jump. If you really don't want to go through Story of the World yet again, don't go through Story of the World yet again. Do something else. Do something that gives you all the advantage of being kind of new and unknown. That might perk you all up a little bit. And by the way, I don't think anybody enthusiastically does every project in the Story of the World workbook. I mean, when my kids were working through Story of the World, I maybe did one project per chapter. And sometimes we just did the ice cream boats again because that was their favorite, even if it had absolutely nothing to do with the lesson. So maybe changing the routine, maybe assigning one of those older kids with senioritis the task of leading history projects. See if you can turn that dynamic around a little bit. If the older students really are in any way discouraging the younger ones from learning, and this is where we get out of education and into parenting, you need to deal with that. You need to approach that directly, whether it's in conversation or whether it's offhanded comments. Teenagers are great at passive aggressive comments.
Right.
Oh, I'm so glad I don't have to do that anymore.
Yeah.
This is the kind of thing that does affect younger students, but that you're going to have to deal with that directly, and privately with the older student. Take them into another room, say, okay, I'm sure you did not intend for that to be a discouraging statement, but do you realize that you're telling your younger sibling that they should expect to not enjoy learning, that they should expect to hate what they're doing? Please don't do that. And if that attitude continues, or if you get resistance from the older children, then that really is an issue for family therapy or counseling, or for your religious community to address. But don't just shrug it off as normal senioritis. Tackle it directly. Don't let that go by unnoticed.
Yeah. We look up to our older siblings so much at that age. It just reminded me when I was in middle school, I loved Dickens, and I talked to my big brother about books all the time because he was the other person in the family that loved books. And he made a statement one time, I think something about Tale of Two Cities being Dickens' worst book. And I read Tale of Two Cities thinking it was boring. And he was like, they always assign this book in public school and it's the worst one of them all. And I reread Tale of Two Cities later and I was like, you know what? I really like this book. And I've really not liked it because my brother didn't like it all these years. So that was a realization I had to have. But for so many years, I was affected by my brother's opinion because I looked up to him so very much.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up. My husband is the youngest of 5 brothers. And he's 63 now. And he is still, every once in a while he'll go like, wait a minute, my brother told me that. And that's why I've been doing this all this time. And that's just stupid. I mean, his brothers really did convince him of so many things that were just not true because they they were big brothers.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I remember, actually, this is a silly example, but my second son was absolutely convinced until he was, at least 10, that if he pulled up moss, the world would fall apart.
Oh, no.
Because his older brother had told him that moss was what held the world together. And so if he pulled up the moss, the world would fall apart. And one day he just had an absolute conniption when he saw me clearing up some moss. And I was like, what is happening? I don't understand. And, far past the age when he could have thought, oh, actually, that's ridiculous. Those things stick.
Right.
So maybe just a conversation with the older students who are probably not thinking of themselves as mentors. They're thinking of themselves as children.
Right.
Just to sort of expose the idea that they really are influencing their younger siblings and they need to do so for better and not for worse might be a really big part of this dynamic.
Yeah. I agree.
So I'll just make one more practical suggestion. If you have absolutely just lost your enthusiasm for a subject, think about outsourcing it. Whether it's an online course, whether it's hiring a tutor, whether it's hiring one of your older children to teach it to a younger child. If there's something that you just can't face doing, but it's not the whole schooling situation, it's just one subject, outsource it. You don't have to keep afflicting yourself with the responsibility to do that. You can turn it over to somebody who's got a little bit more enthusiasm than you do, and you'll all be better off for it.
Yep, that makes sense. And also aligns with the teaching children of different age groups. When you're outsourcing it to an older sibling, they're learning and they're enjoying. My brother did a PE class for us. He took us out for a long time every day to either play soccer or ultimate frisbee with us. And again, those are some of my favorite memories from homeschooling. And he was in high school. He got exercise. He loved it. And he taught us the rules of all these different games. And that gave me the confidence to play them when I was at church or whatever. So it was a really positive thing. Okay, we're going to move on to our next question from Catherine, which is, how do we combat the serious decline of verbal ability among students? And then she left a quote from a article, a research study, which says that when controlled for educational attainment, American adults' vocabulary has declined between the mid-1970s to the 2010s. The vocabulary of American college graduates declined more than a half a standard deviation over this time period. And vocabulary has also been declining among those with a 4-year college degree. So how do we combat this decline?
One word: audiobooks. What did you think my one word was going to be, Susanna?
I was about to blurt out, read. Just read.
Well, no, and you're right. That is absolutely what students should be doing. But audiobooks is sort of like a backdoor into that. Part of the reason for this vocabulary decline simply is, well, not part of the reason is simply that students are exposed to less literary language than they used to be. And that is partly because social media, other things have replaced the habit of reading.
Right.
The dialogue in your average movie is much less vocabulary rich than the vocabulary you would get in, say, A Tale of Two Cities if you were reading that. But it is difficult to go directly to, well, read more. Yes, they should read more. And yes, in your family, you should do everything that you can to set regular reading times where students get to read anything they want, as long as it's a book. And no shade on graphic novels. I appreciate that this is an art form all of its own. But in terms of vocabulary building, I mean, a book without pictures. But also, audiobooks really get all of that rich language into kids' minds without the muscular fatigue of, their eyes moving, which of course they do need to read, but you can get so much more vocabulary into a student's mind with an audiobook because you don't have the weariness factor. Audiobooks have a sort of an automatic, a built-in anti-distraction, which is their ears are already occupied. So they can't be watching something or listening to something at the same time.
Right.
If they're doing an audiobook. So unabridged, non-dramatized audiobooks of books that are written for adult readers, then that is the number one way. Now, look, with younger children, definitely do all of the middle grade classics like Charlotte's Web and all of the E.B. White books, the Chronicles of Narnia, the Chronicles of Prydain, all of the Lewis Carroll books. There's just so many fantastic books, and we have lists and lists of them in the Well-Trained Mind. But the more they listen to audiobooks, the more that they will not only hear that vocabulary, but they'll hear it in context.
Yeah.
And they're going to be more likely to use it themselves in that case.
Yeah. And this feels like a very natural time to mention that we sell a lot of audiobooks on our website. And you can also get audiobooks at the library. They have these new playback books where you can just check out the exact book you want, and has everything you need to listen to it that you check out, which is really cool. And kids enjoy that. So anyway, audiobooks and reading, that's the only way, really.
It really is. Because, you can do vocabulary study, but you're gonna only really remember and reuse the words that you hear in context and in a meaningful context for you.
Right.
We'll be back after this.
Want to find the best prices of the year on homeschool materials? Visit the Well-Trained Mind Summer Sales. From June 18th through 25th, 2024, save up to 40% on the world's best homeschool materials. Visit welltrainedmind.com to take advantage of these savings. And look for other sales coming in July and August.
All right, so now we're going to move into some questions more specific towards younger students or the grammar stage. And our first question there is from Marie, who talks about, how do I transition from kindergarten to first grade when expectations seem to jump? She said, particularly with language arts, expanding beyond phonics into grammar, composition, spelling, and understanding literature, what advice do you have for making that transition as graceful as possible?
Such a good question. And I think this is from a first-time homeschool parent with their oldest child is heading from kindergarten into first grade. Which is, I know, it's exciting. It's exciting. So the first thing I would say is it's possible that you are thinking that first grade is more complicated than it actually is. So, in the Well-Trained Mind, for example, we have lots of things that you can do during the grammar stage, but first grade, there are 4 things that are super, super important for first grade. Beginning arithmetic, handwriting practice, reading, and beginning writing, by which I mean mostly just copy work.
Right.
First grade, that is a lot. They are still really learning. They are still, in many cases, struggling with these basic skills. So my advice always to first-time homeschool parents is for the first 6 weeks of school, just do those basics. Just do your those 4 subjects and make sure that you're comfortable with them and the child is comfortable with them, and then start adding, and then add some history in, and then add some spelling in, and then add some science projects in. But make sure that the student is comfortable with those basics first, because there is going to be, a rising level of complexity.
Right.
So you want to give them the space to really get established with that and be comfortable with it. I think what can be tempting, particularly with your oldest child, is to start first grade with an 8-hour school day.
Yeah.
Because there's so much cool stuff out there you could do.
Right.
And it'll just kill their little enthusiasms. They'll be so tired. So remember that you're going to be doing this for 12 years.
Yeah.
And you don't have to do it all in first grade.
That is a comfort. that feels nice. And also remembering that each of these subjects, each of these 4 things and beyond, you don't need to do them for a very long time each day either. You're not spending an hour on history every day. You're not spending
10
an
or
hour
15
on math.
minutes.
Right. You're looking at 10 to 15 minute chunks with a snack in between or some outside playtime in between, as your child is excited for school, and you're using that excitement and that, wow, I'm in school now, to kind of start building those routines for the first time. It doesn't have to be too heavy time-wise.
Yep. And since this parent particularly asked about language arts, expanding beyond phonics, let me just make a quick comment about each one of these aspects of language arts that the parent brings up into grammar. Yes, indeed. You're doing grammar orally. That's why we did first language lessons, and other resources that we recommend are oral. In first grade, you are not going to do a lot of written grammar because those little first grade hands really will fall off. Their fine muscle coordination is not there. So yes, you're doing grammar, but you're doing it orally in a age appropriate sort of, question and answer way. You're not adding lots and lots of worksheets. Composition, same thing. First graders are not writing compositions.
Right.
First graders are doing copy work. And once they're familiar with copy work, they can move on to doing some beginning dictation. But they've got to do that before, quote unquote, composition.
Right.
Spelling. Yes, spelling is important. They got to do their spelling. And then also, though, the parent says understanding literature for a first grader. So if I might soapbox for just a moment, first graders should not have to, quote unquote, understand literature. First graders should read stories. End. Stop. Full stop. So there are a lot of curricula for grammar stage children that, particularly for first and second graders, ask them to begin to analyze and express ideas about literature. And I say this both as an educator and as a writer, and as a parent. That is developmentally inappropriate. First and second graders should just be reading stories. Yeah. And I've said this often in my workshops. The only question that a first or second grader should be asked to answer about a story is, what happened? They don't need to understand literature. They don't need to answer questions about motivation. None of this is appropriate for a first and second grader. They don't have the mental sophistication or the background of stories, storylines, plots, characters that only comes from exposure to be able to answer those questions in a meaningful manner. So I do feel like perhaps this parent is maybe eyeballing a curricula that is not appropriate for a first grader.
Yeah. But what I would say, what I love about this question is I can see with this first time homeschool parent that there's already a spidey sense here. There's already a feeling of, hey, I think what I'm planning to do is maybe too much for my student, or I'm feeling pushback. The expectations seem too high. So being responsive to that is such a wonderful privilege of homeschooling, where you can feel those feelings. You can watch your children and observe how they're learning and make adjustments. And that sounds like what she's doing.
And Susanna, I'm so glad you brought that up, because all homeschool parents struggle with this sense of, oh, I'm not quite doing enough. I'm not doing it well enough. I'm not doing it good enough. And because we have this, which is just an extension of, I don't know if your daughter is old enough for you to be feeling this yet, Susanna, but as a parent, you always feel like you're not parenting well enough either. So it's really just, and it's an understandable sense. It's a reflection of your understanding that this is a really important task.
Right.
It's really vital. So it's understandable that that sense is there. But what happens when we homeschool, and I think particularly when we're homeschooling really little ones, is that generalized parental anxiety does get transferred over to academics. And so sometimes we know what is appropriate for our child, but we push children beyond what is developmentally appropriate because we're trying to be good parents. We're trying to be good educators. We're trying to do the best possible job. And you have got to regularly check in with your gut.
Right.
And say, no, I don't need to do this. No, my child is fine. No, my child is done for the day. I'm going to really go down a rabbit trail here, if I may.
Rabbit trail away.
Rabbit trail away. So I am training a young horse.
How fun. Well, it sounds like fun. Maybe it's hard.
Well, it is fun. It's also sort of terrifying because they're, a young horse is like a 1,400-pound toddler. Where if all of a sudden it has a tantrum, there's not a lot you could do. So I'm training this young horse, and I am constantly saying to myself, you know what we just did there? We just did a beautiful 20-meter circle at the trot with the horse responding to the aids, bending properly, and accepting the bit. And I thought today maybe we would go on and do some canter work, but now I'm going to stop. And the reason I'm going to stop is because the horse did such a lovely job at this basic task that I want them to recognize, good job, well done, right? So when we're dealing with young children, you've got to be willing to do that same thing. You were going to do both sides of the worksheet. The kid works really hard, does the first side absolutely beautifully. You got to be willing to say to yourself, that was enough, and say to the kid, good job. Here's a chocolate chip. Go play. Give yourself the freedom to do that because remember, it's just first grade. Right. You got a lot more years to come.
Right. Awesome. All right. Our next question comes from Becca. She asks, would you recommend having a student type copywork rather than write by hand when accommodating for dysgraphia? How do handwriting and typing compare as learning tools?
Yeah, and then we have a little bit more detail here, which is interesting. Do you mind sharing that as well?
Yes. So she talks about how her fourth grader really struggles with handwriting. I require him to actually write one sentence of copywork a day, and the rest of his work is done orally or typed. How do you feel typing compares to handwriting and teaching composition?
Right. Yeah. So I wanted you to read that just because I think that is a really good way to deal with this particular problem. So a fourth grader who struggles with handwriting one sentence is definitely dealing with dysgraphia. And I would hope that the parent would have the child properly evaluated and doing some physical or occupational therapy with somebody who is actually, equipped to give exercises to help with that particular condition, because it can be very frustrating. In the meantime, the parent is absolutely right. Yes, typing it is absolutely fine. Now, I would say that typing copywork is probably pointless because when you're typing, the point of copywork is to reproduce what's on the page. Reproduce it from one page to your page. And that has in my opinion, limited value when you're typing, but definitely typing dictation, absolutely incredibly useful. Right. And so if you're giving dictation to a student who's typing, you're going to be doing the same sorts of things that you would do if you were giving dictation and they were writing. That is, you're going to watch what they're doing. And if they're misspelling or skipping spaces or doing something weird, with punctuation, you're going to stop them and have them do it correctly before you go on. They're still getting a lot of the benefits of dictation. They're just taking that difficult handwriting element out of it. It's an interesting question about how do handwriting and typing compare as learning tools. Obviously, when you're typing, your brain and your hands have a different relationship than if you're writing. Because if you're writing and you're reproducing an A, then your hand makes a circular motion, and then you can't see me, but I'm writing things in the air. If you're doing a V, it's a whole different motion. If you're doing a U or an I, these are all different hand motions. So what your hand is doing is reinforcing to your brain that these are different letters that have different functions and make different sounds. Obviously, when you're typing, you're basically making the same motion for every single letter. Right. So there is some reinforcement that happens when you are handwriting that doesn't happen when you're typing. So for younger students, first, second graders who are still developing that sort of letter awareness, absolutely handwriting is preferable. But if you've got a kid that struggles so hard with the handwriting aspect that it is getting in the way of learning, that is not a hill you want to die on. Let them type everything. Yes, it's a really good idea to have them continue to do some sort of handwriting practice because you want to still build up those muscles. Don't forget that handwriting is a physical activity, but it is 100% the right thing to do to let them go ahead and type. And there've been, once you get up to that like between fourth and sixth grade area, I don't know how many parents I've said, stop fighting this battle, let them type.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was looking on our forums. A lot of parents share similar experiences on there working with students who have dysgraphia. There may be other ideas on there that would be worth looking into, but the curriculum Handwriting Without Tears, a lot of folks recommended as a way to continue practicing that writing, especially when they're younger, but then allowing them to do their content work, anything where handwriting is getting in the way of their learning just on the computer typing. That seemed to be the preference of many families working with this particular learning struggle, I guess you might say.
Yeah. And I do think Handwriting Without Tears is a really great tool for that.
All right. So for our next question, this is an interesting one, a little longer, but the question is from Mary, who says, when is it too early to let gifted kids focus the majority of their time on a special interest rather than on general studies? And then she provides some context and examples. She said, what do I do if I have gifted students in the grammar logic stage area or transition whose interests take up a lot of time? And what age is too early to start letting them focus on their strengths for the majority of their day at the expense of subjects that don't relate to their specialty? And this is crucial. How will this impact college admissions? So I have young children, but their strengths are already crystal clear. When do we recognize it's time to spend the majority of time on strengths and less time on subjects that don't relate to their specialty? And then there's a couple of examples here to contend with. The first example would be for a 9-year-old boy who's already learning 3 languages, loves reading, loves writing, not interested in STEM. Can we de-emphasize STEM at this age? Is it too early? Another example would be someone who's 11, so more in the logic stage, but already knows she wants to be a professional musician and spends hours every day practicing instruments. How much time does she really need to spend on math? Will it really hurt her when she gets to college if, she's playing beautiful instruments or speaking multiple languages, but still struggles with algebra?
Oh, my goodness, there's much to unpack here.
It's a big question, but a really interesting one.
It is an interesting one. So I guess where I want to start is and because I think this is going to sort of guide us to a useful perspective, I'm going to quibble with the word gifted because we often use gifted as shorthand for sort of, how should I put this, chronologically accelerated. Right? Kids who are simply moving through subjects more quickly than their peers. And gifted has this sort of, I don't know, it's a word that has bothered me more and more in recent years, because it implies that these kids have something that other kids don't, right? They have a gift. Yes, there are students who excel in certain areas with what seems to be less effort, but how that usually manifests itself is that they are moving through those subjects more quickly, okay? So it's not unusual to learn 3 languages and to love to read and write. It's a little more uncommon to be 9 years old and to be learning 3 languages. So this kid is on a different developmental path than his peers. The reason why this is important, and so for example, I'm sort of focusing in for the moment on this example, one of the 9-year-old boy who will not be pursuing a career in STEM. Okay, 9 is way too young to decide that you're not going to be pursuing a career in STEM, which, by the way, is a huge term, which incorporates all sorts of things, including linguistics, by the way, that a student who is linguistically aware might actually be very interested in. So yes, 9 years old is way, way, way too early to close that door. I'm going to come back to that thought in a minute. But he will not be pursuing a career in STEM. Well, here's the thing with quote unquote gifted kids. Normally what's happening with them is that their brains are developing sort of along 2 tracks. The language processing of their area of their brain is developing along 1 track. And the math and science processing area of their brain is developing along another track. And sometimes those are just chronologically offset. So one way of handling information seems much more natural because it's developed faster and the other lags behind. So you have got to give young children time and space for that other way of processing information, that other way of learning to mature and catch up. And those of you who have followed this podcast have heard me say this before. We just got to let the earth go around the sun one more time before we come to these decisions. So he will not be pursuing a career in STEM. About a 9-year-old strikes me as a lack of understanding about this maturing process, that in 3 years, and certainly once he goes through puberty, he's going to have an entirely different brain than he does right now. Do we discourage this 9-year-old from spending as much time as possible on the things that he loves? Absolutely not. We make as much space as we possibly can in the schedule for that. Do we de-emphasize the STEM subjects? No, not yet. Not yet. We let him pursue those on a lower level and more slowly while we wait to see what the maturation of the brain is going to look like, right? I would be very careful, and this is just sort of a rule of thumb, I would be very careful about declaring that a kid is not going to go into one area or another until after puberty. Because you just don't know how their brains are going to mature. You cannot predict it. Does that make sense, Susanna?
Yeah, no, I definitely think that makes sense. You never want to close doors, but I think the balancing statement is that like you do want to make time in the schedule for the things that they enjoy and celebrate that and celebrate their success in that, whilst also managing to make progress, even if it is slower and not at that same level with the subjects that they don't enjoy as much. That makes sense to me.
Now, a wrinkle on this, of course. So there I was reacting to the example of the 9-year-old boy who loves to read and write and learn 3 languages and will not be pursuing a career in STEM, which I feel should be left as an open question until he's a bit older, by which I mean 13 or 14, at least, at the earliest. The second example was of an 11-year-old who wants to be a professional musician. When you're dealing with kids who are on a professional track, you're dealing with a slightly different situation, right? Whether that kid is a musician or whether they're an athlete, if they're in any sort of professional or pre-professional field, then you're doing a slightly different calculus. But what you have to remember is the uncertainty of all of these professional fields.
Right.
She wants to be a professional musician. That's great. We're not going to discourage her in any way. I am saying to you, the parent, do you realize how uncertain a career that is? Do you realize that we don't even know, because we never know, how AI is going to affect the music industry? Do you realize that we don't know what the music industry will look like in 10 years when she is getting ready to launch on her professional career? No, we have no idea. So how much time does she really need to spend on math and science? Well, until she finishes out high school, she needs to spend as much time on math and science as is prescribed by your state, because those guidelines have been set in order to give kids basic competency. And any child who is heading for a professional field has got to have basic competencies across the curricula, because those professional fields are so incredibly uncertain.
Right. So what I'm hearing is like for those skill-based subjects, math and writing and reading, you're going to be using those no matter what. And maybe there's a little bit more flexibility there with history and science for a student who is really busy preparing to be a Olympic gymnast or whatever the case may be, but they're still going to need those basic skills.
100%. And in fact, these professional kids probably more even than other kids.
I want to touch back on the college admission side of things really quickly, because the example here was a student struggling with algebra, but is brilliant and ahead in something else. What does that look like? Do college admissions care? I know we have a whole podcast, which I would actually recommend this listener check out, on classical education for college-bound students, where we kind of go through the basics that a college is going to be looking for when they're admitting your child, so that you kind of know the track they need to be on in elementary, middle school to meet those basic high school requirements if they are planning to go to college.
And I agree with you. That would be a good thing for these parents to listen to. I guess maybe I wouldn't mind addressing the underlying fear here.
Mm-hmm.
And just because so many decisions that we make for our kids' education can be dictated by this, are they going to get into college? It is so counterproductive to make educational decisions based on, well, let me start by saying based on the likelihood of a kid getting into any particular college.
Right.
Right? Because as we have said before, and we'll say again, getting into any particular college is a matter of chance more than you know, because there are so many applications. And especially now that the applications procedures to college have been streamlined so that you can apply to like 12 colleges with one application. College admissions offices are flooded. They are overwhelmed. They get so many applications that the chance that your kid's application is really going to jump out really depends on who puts their hand on that folder on one particular day and what they had for lunch. And I am not kidding when I say that. So you have to, from the time that they start school, you've got to tuck away the hope that they will go to any one particular college, because there is just no way to guarantee that. And I mean, even if you were a graduate of that college, legacy admissions are now under fire. There's just no way to guarantee that. So having said that, are they going to get into college? Yes. Yes. Might it be a community college for the first 2 years? Yes. What is wrong with that? Don't be a snob. Absolutely nothing. It's a great path into a 4-year degree. A small private 4-year college, a women's college, a men's college, a historically Black college or university. There's so many amazing options out there. I can guarantee you your kid will get into college. Is it going to be one of the top 5 on the U.S. News and World Report? Just put that away and stop thinking about it, because there's no way to make that happen, no matter how many different classes they take. So it would just be nice if we could decouple these two questions, because one question has to do with the child's well-being.
Right.
What do they need to study in order to set themselves up for a good life, in order to have the skills to do what they want to do? That is a separate question from, are they going to get into college?
That's fair. Yeah. I have one of my regrets in life is being in high school so focused on wanting to get into a quote unquote good school, to sort of, I don't know, prove myself as a homeschooler that I was actually smart because only my parents were telling me so. I'm not sure where it was coming from, but it was a huge focus of mine that took a lot of time away from things I wish I had spent time on. Like, I wish I had maintained my piano practice and my flute playing more than I ended up caring about my SAT score in the long run. Like having a great SAT score was great for the moment, but nobody cares now. And in the meantime, I gave up playing the flute, and now I wish I could play the flute. I gave up some hobbies that would have continued to enrich my life much more than an SAT score. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
That is very well put. And Susanna, I think also as a homeschooled student, I had that same insecurity of feeling like I had to keep proving that I was smart, because I had this weird education and nobody could really judge it. And then I ended up going to a terrible college, absolutely awful, so bad that I don't even put it on my resume, and I'm fine.
Right. You survived.
I survived. Everything's good. I have a good life.
Right.
Yeah. So we can probably, I don't know, maybe for next season, I would really love to see if we could get some college admissions people who have experience with college admissions on to talk to us about this whole project. But I don't know, they'll probably have to sign some sort of non-disclosure, but maybe we can find somebody who didn't sign the NDA.
Awesome. All right. We have 2 more questions. We're running here on an hour, so we are going
Oh my goodness, we've been talking for so long.
So we're going to speed through these last questions. The next one is one that we actually received many times in different ways. So I'm going to paraphrase it first and then go into specific examples. Can you discuss strategies for beginning the classical approach, quote unquote, late? So let's say you want to start classical homeschooling, but you didn't start in first grade. You've just discovered the well-trained mind. You want to start using it, but how do I jump in? And we have a few different examples that I think are interesting to get into. So one would be a second grader and a sixth grader coming in from public school. One is a student coming from an unschooling model where grammar, logic, and rhetoric weren't considered. And another is a middle schooler coming out of a Montessori school who is intelligent and readily soaks up information, but is lazy with writing and grammar, is the phrase the parent used, and below grade level in those subjects. So how do we jump into using the well-trained mind as a model when we haven't been using it from first grade?
Yeah. So rule of thumb, and this would apply in all of these areas, is for the skill subjects, and I know this is a distinction we've brought up several times in this question and answer session, skill subjects, writing, language arts and math, basically. Mm-hmm. You put them in at their skill level and don't worry too much if that's way below where you think they ought to be. It doesn't do any good to put, say, a sixth grader who is writing at a fourth grade level into a sixth grade curriculum. Mm-hmm. They're just going to struggle and be frustrated. You're not going to achieve anything. You've got to be willing to put them in at their skill level in language arts and in math.
Right.
Then in terms of the subject areas, the science, the history, geography, to some extent, reading, literature, that you can finesse a little bit more. You can put them in at their grade level, use our recommendations for that particular grade level, and just, be aware if they start to struggle. Mm-hmm. But for example, if they're at the age where you really want them to be doing modern history, you shouldn't be fretting about the fact that they haven't already done ancient and medieval and Renaissance mm-hmm. history. Not a problem. Put them in. Mm-hmm. If you think they should be doing biology, but it's the year for them to do chemistry, fine, put them in at chemistry. Mm-hmm. Just be aware of whether or not they're struggling. So mm-hmm. skills at skill level, actual skill level.
Right.
Subjects at grade level.
Right. And a lot of curriculum providers will offer placements. So if you're purchasing a curriculum, you can look it up. For example, if you're using Writing with Ease, we have a placement you can give your child to figure out which level to start at. A lot of homeschool presses have the same.
And a really good starting place for anyone who is sort of like starting this process in the middle is to go ahead and give the kids a standardized test. Mm-hmm. So in the Well-Trained Mind, we recommend a number of different ways where you can give a standardized test at home, and then you can send it away and have it graded. That will give you a better sense of where they are in terms of their skills in particular, and it'll give you a more solid starting place. So I would absolutely do that. There's the California Test of Basic Skills, which I think is probably one of the more useful ones. And Susanna, maybe we can put a link to the information about that in our show notes.
Yep, I will put a link in the show notes.
I wanted to say something about the parent who said that they have an intelligent child who readily soaks up information, but she's lazy.
Oh,
I'm sorry. I just had a bit of a reaction to that, which I may want to share with you. Incorporating moral judgments into academics never helps anything. And lazy is a word that has a moral judgment attached to it. Mm-hmm. So you could say that the child is unmotivated, mm-hmm. but then that leaves you with some questions to answer. Why? Mm-hmm. Right. Where is the child motivated? I don't know of any children that are completely unmotivated on all fronts unless they're suffering from an organic difficulty, in which case that would be something to investigate. What does motivate the student? Why does it motivate them? And how is it that their school assignments are not tapping into that natural interest? Mm-hmm. I don't like the word lazy. I find it kind of doesn't give you anywhere to go with the kid except to scold them or berate them. Or to tell them that they're failing morally they're disappointing you in some way. Again, not helpful if you actually want learning to happen.
Right.
So,
right.
And maybe we can talk about this on a future episode, right?
Yeah.
Because I mean, I had one child that was incredibly challenging in terms of getting the child to actually do what they were supposed to do. But I know from my own experience as a parent that using words like this only made things worse.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think one part that I didn't read out of this listener's question was that she felt it was due to the low expectations at the school. So it wasn't necessarily directed at the student, but then if expectations weren't met of the school, and then you're passing that on to that, your frustration with that onto your child, that could create unnecessary tension between you and your child as you're beginning this homeschool journey.
Agreed.
All right. So we are going to answer one more question, which is another interesting one. How do I add AP classes? And I know you have opinions about AP classes to a classical rhetoric program. And I'll give just a little more context. I'm curious if there is a smooth way to add AP English literature or AP English language along with the 3-year rhetoric series that our Well Trained Mind Academy offers. And then also the same question for AP World History and AP US History. I'm torn between keeping my child in the Well Trained Mind Academy 3-year series versus stopping to find AP classes, which are more favored by the colleges he's looking into. He is homeschooled, so I'm issuing the transcript. And from what I'm finding out, AP tests give measure and credibility to the strength of his college readiness as perceived by college admissions.
Right. So back to the impossibility of guaranteeing that even if that your kid is going to get into any of these colleges, even if he's got 17 AP classes,
Right.
there's a real balancing act that parents have to do here. We want to encourage our kids to have as many options as possible. Of course, the problem with AP classes is AP classes are designed to teach you to pass the AP test.
Right.
That is their purpose. That is kind of diametrically opposed to the project of classical education, which has a lot of space in it for open-ended inquiry and going in new directions that you've just discovered because they're interesting and because you're a human being who wants to expand your mind. So I don't think there is a smooth way to incorporate AP classes into classical rhetoric because they've got two completely different purposes. The purpose of classical rhetoric is to teach a student to think, understand, and respond. And the purpose of an AP class is to teach the student how to do well on an exam.
Right.
Now, if you decide that's the trade-off you and your kid are going to make, okay, that's your choice. Wouldn't be my choice, but yes, just realize that you are making that choice. And also just be clear-eyed about the fact that all those AP scores are not necessarily going to tip the scales for any particular college admissions. Yes, there are colleges that say that AP classes will help with your admission. Do you know how many students they look at who have all AP classes? I mean, it's ridiculous. So you've got to think about what is best for the kid. And if what is best for the kid is to get into a college that needs AP exams, okay, that's your choice to make. I'm just repeating yet again that you still haven't guaranteed them that they're going to get into that college. If what is best for them is a more holistic approach to education, then I would forget about the AP classes. We don't actually offer AP classes at the Academy for this reason, because at the moment, we don't see a way that they are compatible with the project of classical education. We do have classes that will prepare a student to take an AP test. But, and by the way, in case you didn't know this, you can take an AP test even if you haven't had a quote unquote AP class. All you do is say, yes, I've studied the subject. You have that option. But I really think kind of in this, you're going to have to make a choice about what direction that you want to go. Remember, though, that there are other examination programs that can sort of like verify the grades on your kid's transcript. So CLEP exams, for example, and others. We have a list, I believe, both on our website and in the Well Trained Mind book. So I understand the need to have outside verification of a grade, but just don't get stuck in the trap of thinking that AP is the only way to do it.
Yeah. For sure. And I took AP classes. I didn't take AP classes. I self-studied for AP tests and enjoyed it, but I absolutely studied to the test. And there was a sense of accomplishment there. I didn't do a lot. I did 4, I think. And there was a sense of accomplishment there with doing well on the test after studying specifically for that test, but it wasn't maybe the ideal high school education. It was kind of what was available to me at the time. And I enjoyed it. But that was, again, I think this may not be the answer this listener wants to hear, but it's a realistic answer that they're really 2 different tracks.
They're 2 different tracks. They're 2 different choices. You make your choice and, and then you just stick with it. That's how we parent. That's how we school.
Right. All right. Well, we're going to finish off actually with something that is not a question, but Susan, I know that you wanted to share.
Yeah. So we got a wonderful comment from Anna Jane, who is a nurse practitioner, homeschooling mom, and a mom of special needs kids. And she says the episode on burnout definitely hit home for her. But she had, which coming from someone in the medical field, I thought was a really useful clarification. She said, I have a comment, and that was your recommendation that patients not seek mental health support from their OBGYN and instead seek out a mental health professional, which is something that I said because of my own experience of having antidepressants described to me by an OBGYN who never did any follow-up or just wrote me the prescription and that was it. So Anna Jane says, if patients waited to see a psychiatrist or mental health NP or PA, they may never get treatment or get treatment far too late because there aren't enough mental health providers. In addition, and this would be if you were pregnant, providers outside of OB are terrified to order anything for a pregnant woman. So sometimes the only option is to go to your OB. And then she says this, on the positive side, things are changing in our education. General practitioners and OBs, as well as all the other specialties, are getting more education on how to handle basic mental health care and when to refer. There are actually a lot of non-prescribing therapists out there, and they are easier to get in with. So one option many patients partake in is medication ordered by their primary care physician, coupled with counseling with a non-prescribing therapist. So I really appreciated that clarification. My point, I think, was just that if your OB prescribes antidepressants, that's fine, but that just shouldn't be the end of the process. That also should be paired with counseling. And you may get to a point where you have to ask your OB to refer you to a mental health professional if you're struggling with, deep depression or, some other disorder that is really interfering with your life. Right. So, but she's absolutely right that I think for a lot of us in our childbearing years, our OBGYN is the only doctor we see on a regular basis.
Right.
So there's nothing wrong with that being a good starting place. And I really did appreciate that clarification because I know so many women do struggle with mental health challenges and don't really know how to address them. So Anna Jane, thank you for that. I really appreciate it.
Yes. And thank you to all our listeners who submitted questions. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get to all of them today. We're going to have to save some of them for a later Q&A podcast. But that is actually a wrap for season 2 of the Well-Trained Mind podcast.
Oh, and we ended up with a long one. So now you guys can all take a deep breath and eat a bowl of ice cream.
Right. So thank you all so much for your support, for your questions, for your comments. We really appreciate them. We're excited to share more details about season 3 soon. In the meantime, remember to subscribe so you can be notified when we do return with season 3. And as always, we love to hear from you, your thoughts on classical education, home education, school education, or any kind of education that interests you. You can reach us at podcast@welltrainedmind.com. Thanks for listening.